So just as an introduction, for those who don't know me, my name is Paul Wohrer. I am the head of the space program here at Ifri. For all of those for whom it's the first time coming to Ifri, welcome. We have seen in April of this year, in April 2026, that millions of people around the world followed with bated breath as humans flew around the moon for the first time since 1972. This event has illustrated the fact that the moon has, again, become the focal point of human space exploration. The current plans include the USA, who want a moon landing by 2028. China and Russia are planning their own landing by 2030. And India has evoked a future possible moon landing by 2040. These ambitions, these programs, and the diplomatic efforts that go with them are creating a trend that many have described as a new moon race. To help us better understand the geopolitical stakes of this dynamic, its risks and opportunities in terms of international cooperation and international competition, Ifri and myself are very happy to welcome European and international experts who will provide their own perspectives and add their voice on the growing debate on the place of Europe in this enterprise. I would like to remind you a few ground rules. This conference is public, therefore it's not covered by the Chatham House rule, as many conferences at Ifri are. It is also recorded, and the replay of this conference will be made available in a few days. So to introduce this conference, I would like to welcome to the floor General Philippe Adam, former space commander of the French Air and Space Force Space Command, and current Secretary General for the International Space Summit, which will be hosted in Paris in September. General, you have the floor, and to all, I wish you a very good conference.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you very much for this invitation to take the floor in front of you. It's pretty intimidating for me. It's the first time in the Ifri facilities, so it's a good opportunity. I had to wait until I left the service, of course, to come here, but it's a pleasure and an honor to give you this quick address. But I'm sure you're also very excited to hear the panelists. I think they are the heart of the subject, and my privilege as a keynote speaker, of course, is try and funnel you to this panel conversation and try to put things a little bit in perspective. And of course, my position as the Secretary General for the International Summit on Space next September, of course, offers the perfect perspective, in my opinion. Why is that? First of all, this summit is the first of its kind, we think. At least we try to find to offer something that has never been offered before. The motivations of this summit is that we are living in a very fast changing space environment, facing new risks, facing different strategies, facing developments that are forcing us to develop new strategies in space, and certainly to envisage new services and new things coming from space for the future. In all that, of course, the sustainability of those activities are at stake. There is a global race going on, of course, for space, because everything is more available. It's easier to go in space than it has even been before. And we see many, many new operators, of course, trying to face that challenge or to try to take the benefits of these new technologies. And many operators, of course, for all the countries all over the planet, of course. Everybody has a stake in what's happening in space now. And that's why its international summit is important, and its objectives are more to assess collectively the challenges that we face than to bring solutions. We have to explore the possibilities for mitigating the risks and to maintain sustainability for the future. So the future is preserved for the sake of humanity, of course, but also for the sake of everybody's interests. The management of the global commons that is space right now is really global, because there are no borders, and because it requires a sense of common interest, which is probably a bit difficult to find right now, and we need to define it all together. The French analysis for the summit conducted around 4 lines of discussions that you can find in its space strategy published last summer. So those 4 lines of discussions are security, economics of space, regulation, and science and exploration. They will be all explored in Paris in September, not to find answers, as I already said, but to at least agree on questions, or at least agree on the problems that we face. How important are those problems? Why does it matter to us to find solutions and to ask ourselves those questions? What should we be doing about it? What is fair competition in space? How much time do we have? What kind of resources do we need to commit to make sure that we face those challenges? So there's plenty full of questions, and that's why we think that we need to offer this kind of discussions between heads of states and governments, but also with the main decision makers of the economic world. Of course, you probably didn't hear anything in the 4 topics that I listed. The exploration, the launch capabilities, of course, but are everywhere, of course. Space is meaningless if you can't launch, of course. But you will see that this launch subject is encapsulated in the other ones. And certainly it's not a focus, and certainly not an open focus for the summit. Those 4 lines of discussions, or 4 types of questions, are obviously interconnected. And it's the same thing about our interest in space. They are all interconnected. You can't reflect on your national interest without considering the other's interest, of course. They are interconnected. And again, the fact that there is no borders in space make it completely different of all the other domains that we face on the surface of Earth. The main objective is, for us, for the future, is make sure that we plan accordingly, or at the level of the challenges that we face. And again, making sure that what we are doing is sustainable, or keep the space sustainable, keep space activities sustainable for the future, in a sense that we will be able to continue those activities in the future. Of course, this summit intends also to prove wrong. It's an interesting coincidence that I came across a paper by a young researcher in Rennes called Dylan Rayman. He wrote a paper on geopolitics in space very recently. It's a quite interesting thesis in 156 pages, so it's quite a volume. But his conclusion is interesting. He concludes that our economic policies and military trends condemn our space activities to collapsing in a mid to long term. So, of course, that's not what we want. And that's certainly not what public powers want. And what our public powers want is that we can avoid that, of course. And for that, we have to plan, and we have to face some difficulties, of course. And the discussion, the global discussion, is important, because we will all face the same difficulties, the same challenge, and we have to meet them all together, of course. Now, where's the connection to the moon discussion? On the tracks I described previously, one stands slightly out of the others, is the one about science and exploration. And why does it stand a little out? In fact, because its interests or its challenges are slightly peculiar or different to others. And to be blunt about it, for some, I was tempted to write for many, it carries no interests apart from prestige and fame. And then another quote, this one from Thomas Pesquet, who recently was noted to say, "Everybody in France loves to have an astronaut around. Nobody wants to pay for his flights." And I think that reflection, of course, and remark comes very true in France. It comes very true in other countries as well. It's very true for European perspective, certainly. But it is also about, okay, what's so interesting about having an astronaut around? It's about the claims and ambition as a power to wisely influence the rest of the world. And that connects, in fact, that discussion to the summit. The connection is there, influence and the need for de-escalation instruments, to come back to the paper from that young researcher. If you want to de-escalate, you need to have a voice. But and what is your wisdom? How wise can you be? How interesting is it for you to be wise if you don't have a voice? So that's another challenge we have to meet at the summit, of course, in making sure that Europe has a voice, and to make sure that Europe knows what it has to say, of course. So space exploration has a specific traction when you consider the interest in space. For the sake of space exploration and science, of course, but also for space of technology, but also for what it represents. To be frank with you, space or exploration did not have a very big traction when I started working on the Space Summit. Now things have changed, and I will not enter in why it has changed, of course, but certainly we want to have a real discussion about exploration and everything that's around it, of course, at the summit. If the consequences of the race between China and the US, to be there a bit blunt, of course, have to be anticipated, it also appears that that race has some direct consequences on what we as individual nations, we as Europeans do or don't do, need to do or need not to do, of course. So that there's a real interest to take that discussion aboard and to build the full solution around that part also of the discussion and that part of the problem. So obviously, the European problem is not something to be debated in public at the summit, but exploration in general has to be debated because, again, it is certainly not independent of all the other subjects, not dependent on space economics, not independent on regulation and everything that goes with it. Legal space, as some call it, and it has also some implication, indirect implications in security. To meet our strategic goal and to prepare this summit, of course, the questions we have to ask ourselves independently or collectively, of course, is if we ask ourselves if we can leave the competition to others and continue to ride free on other nations' programs. Also ask ourselves if we haven't missed a couple of breakthroughs in the past in space or in other domains. And if we let the things go out of our control, is it not another breakthrough, or will we not miss other breakthrough or things that help us exist in what everybody recognizes as a strategic domain? So in short, and for European and for the sake of a European competition, of course, and in the face of our American participants, at least one, can Europe afford to be a spectator to this competition? I'm sure that this question can be translated to other parts of the world, of course. But certainly Europe has a real question to ask itself right now. And I'm so pleased also to bring that question just when Ariane just had another successful launch. So again, it's a positive side or a positive news when this question looks sometimes so negative. Of course, if the answer was simple, we would probably add a clear answer right now. If we don't have one, it's because it's not simple, and that's why we need to have that discussion. We need to ask ourselves, frankly, that question. We have to make sure that we don't forget something in thinking about the answers we'll give. And we also have to really acknowledge what has changed. So ask ourselves if the answers that we have right now are not the answers of the past world, but the world has changed. So should we change the answers for a future world, or the world that has changed? And certainly it has changed in space. I think that, well, this is my funnel. Of course, I'm trying to channel the interest towards the next panel, of course, and the moon is an interesting and immediate case study for this reflection, and that's why I was pretty happy to have this proposal by Ifri to stand in front of you this afternoon and to give this couple of remarks just before listening to a discussion that I'm sure will be very interesting to all of us. I'm not really sure why the geopolitics of the moon are different or what makes them interesting, but certainly it will help me also to prepare the summit. The summit will be in September in Paris, of course, on the 9 and 10 of September. It's a Wednesday and a Thursday. And it will be in the Grand Palais, very close to the Élysée Palace. I'll let you wonder why. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for Ifri. And I'm leaving the floor to the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I would now invite the panel to take their places on the stage, and you can welcome them by applauding them. I'm going to let Claude France Arnoux present the members of the panel, and we thank you all for being here today to talk about this very timely topic. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for allowing for this panel, and thank you very much for the very stimulating introduction, General, and for the participants to the panel. Just before presenting the participant to the panel, I won't repeat what Paul said. Obviously, the moon has become, over the last 10 years, the focal point for human exploration in space. After decades of neglect, after the Cold War, where it was central. Many great powers are developing plans to land on the moon. You mentioned them, the United States, China, and India. Then now our moon, our satellite, is the object of what is commonly called, again, a moon race, which has political implications. It's about scientific and technological ambitions and leadership, norm setting, international prestige, capturing resources, and preparing further exploration linked to these resources that could be available from the moon. However, the moon is also a place that fosters international cooperation. The Artemis II mission, which flew around the moon, has made headlines in April this year for being a big success. We need that, of course. This mission incorporated elements from the United States and Europe. The Orion spacecraft that carried 4 astronauts around the far side of the moon and back was powered by the European Service Module, built by a team of industrial partners under the leadership of the European Space Agency. This is a reminder that Europe is an important partner and should not be just a spectator, as you said, General. Donc, a partner whose contributions sit at the very heart of the most ambitious human space flight program of our area. The recent selection of Italian astronaut Luca Parmitano in the Artemis III mission crew is a testament to the dedication of Europe to ensure cooperation in space. Yet the partnership raises its own question in the context of challenging transatlantic relation, to say diplomatically, and the rise of private actors. Most of the program's priorities are set in Washington, and they can shift as the recent decisions concerning the Lunar Gateway Station have shown. And to quote Joseph Aschbacher, who is a very moderate man, nevertheless, he commented publicly, decisions to pause Gateway and cancel Mars sample return disrupt Europe's lunar exploration plans, underscoring a broader reality. Europe has become too exposed to decisions beyond its control. Again, the head of the European Space Agency. Meanwhile, China is building its own coalition around the International Lunar Research Station, attracting a growing number of partner states such as Russia, including Russia, and offering an alternative model of lunar cooperation. Between Artemis on one side and this International Lunar Research Station on the other, two competing visions of how humanity should explore, govern, and perhaps exploit the moon are taking shape, touching on question the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, never under your control, I'll come back to that, fully resolved, resource extractions, safety zones, and the protection of heritage sites. For Europe, the stakes are therefore not only technological and scientific, but touch at the heart of European unity and role in space. Well, power and sovereignty, in fact. How should it position itself between cooperation and dependence? And what role can it play in shaping the norms that will govern cislunar space for decades to come? These are precisely the questions, simple questions, our panel will address now. We just, again, thank you for you, General, to have introduced, in fact, part of the question. By the way, you said that initially it was not necessarily the plan to focus on exploration and science for the forum. And you rather cryptically said that finally the decision was taken to do it, but you won't dwell on why. But it would be interesting, if you have any occasion, that we would understand why now it is more of a central point. And perhaps in our discussion, we can try also to address this question, why should it be a central point in the middle of all the issues or questions raised in the field of space. Then now to come to the panel, again, we are very grateful to our panelists to be here. First, Andrea Rother, who came directly under the heat, French heat, from Munich as deputy director, where she is, deputy director of the Academy for Politics, Current Affairs at the Hans Seidel Stiftung Foundation, where you are also head of the Division for Foreign and Security Policy. And since July 2025, you are additionally a non-resident fellow at the American-German Institute in Washington. And of course, your research focuses on transatlantic security cooperation, German and European defense policy, German strategic culture, and the implication on disruptive technology, particularly space. Alesandro Marrone is head of the Italian Academy, the Italian Institute for International Affairs, Defense, Security, and Space Program. Because I don't pronounce Italian, you have simplified the biography I will publicly give. Since 2018, you are also professor at the Institute, you are also the chief of Defense Staff Academy in Italy.
I'm professor at the Chief of Defense Academy. I'm a professor. And
professor of the Chief of Defense Academy, which is much nicer in Italian, but again, I would damage the beauty of the language. And you are a member of the Academic Advisory Board of the NATO Defense College, of the Scientific Board of the Armament Industry European Research Group, ARES, and the Centro to the military as aerospaziale in Italy. Mr. Christopher Johnson, thank you very much to join you. We are not mentioned in the initial program, and we are really grateful that you could come because of the impeachment, sad impeachment of one of our panelists. You are a lecturer in air and space law at Leiden University, Law School's International Institute of Air and Space Law. Formerly, you were the Senior Director of Legal Affairs and Space Law at the Secure World Foundation and Professor of Law adjunct at the Georgetown University Law Center in Washington. You have written widely, sorry, I didn't mention your book. I should also have mentioned your recent contribution, but you have, Professor Johnson, written widely on space law and policy issues, and you are a PhD candidate at Leiden University International Institute on Air and Space Law, writing a monograph on the international legal order for the moon. I will begin, thank you again very much to be here, and I will begin with more, if I may, question to which you can answer also rather officially, engaging the position of, particularly for Italy and Germany, but also from the Netherlands, because of Leiden, on the position of your own country, and then we will ask in a second moment of our session more of your kind of independent expert opinion on some of the issues we mentioned. From Frau Rother, for Andrea, well, firstly, in national perspective, how does Germany view this new race to the moon, and what role do European and transatlantic partnership play in this context, and Germany?
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and also thank you to Paul for having me again after, I think 2 years was the last time I was here when we talked about a European space law. And as has been mentioned, I just flew in from Germany, and so excuse if there's any kind of confusion on my part. Actually, here it's 10 degrees hotter than in Munich. So I come originally from near the Alps, so my body is still adjusting and adapting. But anyways, when we want to talk about space, I think, especially when it comes to the moon and the geopolitical race towards the moon, I have to start with a caveat. So when we think about the debate in Germany, I have to say that the debate on, or the strategic debate on space, and especially the moon and the cislunar space, is pretty much nascent. So of course, Germany has always been very much supportive when it comes to lunar exploration, but this was mainly framed within the framework of science, of technology, within ESA, and of course, international peaceful cooperation. And when we look back to the 2023 German space policy, which was updated after more than 10 years, lunar exploration was one of the main and central pillars when it came to our space policy. So lunar exploration, especially the return to the moon via international partnership, really was one of the cornerstones of this space policy, but just as I said, more or less confined to a scientific civilian approach. When we talk about space policy in Germany these days, and perhaps you follow the news, there's a lot of going on right now, not just when it comes to our defense budget and the overall of our security and defense policies, but this also pertains to space, about how we view space. So when we talk about the Zeitenwende, I don't know if you are familiar with this term in France. So it was due to the war in Ukraine. Many of our assumptions about security and defense in Europe were overhauled, they were just shattered. And so Germany is undergoing a profound process of transforming its defense policy, but this of course also affects how we view space, and especially how we view the geopolitical race to the moon. in a way, you could also say that in terms of space, this could be also called a geostrategic awakening. So from a rather scientific, technology-driven approach towards space, and with this also lunar exploration, to a more strategic thinking. And so what the war in Ukraine actually did, it made us on a broader spectrum realize that the space domain is really a strategic domain. And this, of course, affects how we view lunar and cislunar activities in a way. So perhaps talking about what is going on with regard to space, and then certainly also in more detail with regard to our lunar programs, there are several changes that I briefly want to mention when it comes to Germany's approach to space and the strategic context in this regard. So strategically, might be of interest for you, Germany adopted in 2025 its first ever German safety and security strategy for space, where we basically laid the foundations of assessing space as a strategic domain in terms of what kind of ambitions, what kind of capabilities, and what kind of challenges we are facing in this way. Institutionally also, since for a very long time, space was considered, as I said, rather from a research and an economic standpoint, now more or less to involving a security aspect to that. Germany has undergone some changes to really give credit or give justice to this whole of society approach, whole of government approach, be it in our also newly established National Security Council, or be that, for instance, we are also thinking about or wanting to have a space academy, wargaming centers, strengthening of our armed forces command for space. So you can see from a strategic point of view, it now trickles down to the institutional level. Also financially, there's a huge, let's say, pot of money in the game now. So our Ministry of Defense declared that Germany will be spending about 35 billion euro on space defense, on a secure space architecture until 2030. And of course, this entails that Germany also is stepping up when it comes to acquiring the necessary capabilities in terms of space domain awareness, in terms of resilience, but also in terms of, and this is, I think, where Germany has also adopted a more French approach to space security when it comes to active defense and acquiring offensive capabilities, non-destructive, but at least, you know, being able to deter and defend if necessary. The strategy that I mentioned also has a few glimpses on the moon and lunar activities in this regard. So the strategy is very clear when it talks about future challenges, that the geopolitical competition that we're facing, that were also explained by General Adam, and that these strategic rivalries will extend to the moon and beyond. And for this, of course, Germany takes a very pro-European approach in this regard, because it also mentioned in our strategy that Europe has to be able to reach all relevant orbits, including the orbit around the moon. So this is also mentioned in our strategy. That's why Germany is also supporting the European launcher challenge and European heavy lift launchers for an independent access to the cislunar space area in the long term. And of course, and this is already mentioned very briefly, it also talks about space resources, meaning like space mining, but this is also very briefly mentioned in this regard. So when we talk about how Europe fits into its European and transatlantic partnership, as I mentioned, the European Union and ESA are like the primary framework when it comes to cooperation with or regarding moon and lunar exploration and activities. So in 2025, at the last ministerial meeting of ESA, Germany committed 5.4 billion euro to ESA, making it the largest contributor to ESA with a share about 23%. Germany is also heavily involved in working or in building and further developing the European space module, which is essential for the Artemis program of the United States. So we are contributing roughly 50% to the program, which is also being assembled in Germany. And of course, we are also involved closely in this regard with Italy, for instance, when it comes to the development of the Argonaut, a cargo capability, and Moonlight. So you could say Germany for a very long time, but even more since I think our turnaround in our foreign and security policy has been the financial industrial main supporter of a European approach. Nonetheless, of course, and I will come to an end soon, Germany is heavily invested in a transatlantic relationship because, of course, we know about our dependencies on the United States in this regard. So when we talk about the European space, European service module, Germany, in a way, is also setting the basis for a European share in the transatlantic relationship. We joined the Artemis Accords in 2023, which might be considered rather late. And Germany, as far as I know, but perhaps Christopher knows more about that, is, as far as I know, the only one to sign up to the Artemis Accords with an extra declaration in terms of, while we want to be part of this American endeavor, we have the caveat that, of course, this is a politically non-binding endeavor, non-binding commitment, but that for Germany, multilateral governance within UN format is still the main and the wanted, let's put it like that, the desired place for the establishment of norms and principles when it comes to the moon and further activities. So coming to an end, I think we try to have a balance between, a strong European framework, strong European cooperation, but also the episode, for instance, with the Gateway decision where Europe was not really consulted, attributed to the fact that also Germany wants to have a partnership on a more equal footing, meaning that Germany also wants to make sure that Europe can, let's put it like that, can translate the contributions that we as Germany, but especially as Europe as a whole, contribute to the Artemis program, that we can also translate that into strategic influence. And I think this is where I'll stop, because I'm certain we'll have a discussion about what Europe can do in this regard to strengthen our share in this partnership. But thank you for that.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And we'll come back to this question that you raised finally. Well, I will go directly to Alesandro Marrone, and well, same thing about your national perspective. Well, 3 days ago, NASA named Luca Parmitano as a pilot for Artemis 3, then the first European ever assigned to the program, an Italian. Then before the obvious and legitimate national pride, what does this assignment mean? Tell us about Italy's strategy in space and relation both in a European framework, but also vis-a-vis the United States. And then how does Rome balance the three frameworks of action, ESA, the transatlantic relationship with NASA, and while Italians own national sovereignty and industrial interests. Again.
Thank you, Claude France, for this question. Thank you to Paul and Ifri for inviting me. It's a pleasure. Well, actually, I mean, Italy has a strong track record and an important role in space. Because, for example, it's been the third country worldwide to launch a satellite in orbit in 1964, and being the first two, USA and USSR, it's a good third place in the podium. And until the 80s, Italy had a launching site in Kenya, in Malindi, in Africa. And nowadays, Germany is by far the largest contributor to European Space Agency. France is second, Italy is third, very close to the French budget. And interestingly, the Italian position in space is also a military position, because Italy established the Space Operation Command already in 2021, and the Italian Air Force is the lead service and the force provider to operate in the space domain. And it's interesting because, for example, the Italian military operate their own satellite from a control center with military personnel. It's not outsourced to the private sector. So over the years, the Italian military has developed expertise and doctrine and concept on space operation. So this is a bit one of the background of Luca Parmitano appointment as a pilot, but also as Samantha Cristoforetti as the first female commander of the International Space Station. Both of them come from the Italian Air Force, and not by chance. It's military. There is strong military-civilian cooperation between the Italian Space Agency and the MOD. So Italy launched Cosmos SkyMed Constellation already 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, and it's a dual use by design. So it's a Earth observation for military and civilian purposes, and it's a very advanced model of Earth observation that also, for example, Galileo and Copernicus at EU level are trying to implement. And we established it by law a decade ago, an interministerial steering board under the office of the Prime Minister. So the Prime Minister office coordinates the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Economic Investment, etc., on space policy. Of course, if you have a government that lasts 12 months, it does not work. But if you have a government like the Meloni government that lasts for 4 years and counting, you have more convergence among the ministries and investment and the civil-military relation than before. So, for example, every 3 years we have strategic guidance by this committee chaired by the Prime Minister. The last has been published just a few months ago. So the Italian system is polycentric by nature. It's not a presidential system, but over the last 4 years has been more coherent, let's say, more better organized. And this has an impact also on space policy. Of course, there are weaknesses, there are problems, there are rivalries among ministries, and there are rivalries among the armed forces with respect to the primary role of the Air Force. But the system overall works. And a few words on the industrial sector, because this is one of the reasons Italy is interested in space, because there is an industrial technological ecosystem working on space. And there's an industrial base that covers the whole spectrum of capabilities. So the manufacturing of satellites, the management of space service, and the access to space, the launchers. And it's very important bilateral cooperation with France, because Leonardo and Thales are the major shareholder, respectively, of Thales Alenia Space and Telespazio. And, it's, again, it's not easy. It's not an easy cooperation, let's put it this way. And I say with a very, friendly and frank way to the French colleagues. It's a pity because the two countries can work much better as equal partner and can get much more on space if they work together as a partner, not as a rival. So they cooperate, but there's lots of room of improvement. And one big challenge, and here I echo what Andrea mentioned, is the autonomous access to space. Because the change of paradigm in the US with the reusable launchers, it's a change of paradigm. It's something that risks to misplace, to put out of market the European launchers, and tough choices are on the horizon for Italy, but also for France and for others on autonomous access to space. Space sector in Italy is not just the major companies. There are lots of new space economy PME, which are now rather medium, and they're very innovative and compete pretty well, like Argotech, Planetech, or the Orbit. So this is the background of Italian interest to the moon race. Italy has been the first European country to sign the Artemis Accord in the very first years of their launch during the first Trump administration. And when the Italian military develops its concepts and doctrine and think about space capabilities or counter-space capabilities, it looks together at the cis-lunar security, so with the moon and the Earth in the same environment. The Italian Space Agency, that's been mentioned, cooperates a lot with NASA. And the Italian industries in Turin, they're building the modules, the laboratories for the Luna City, for the lunar bases where the astronauts should live. And other companies are working on the system of communication to connect the Luna City with the cislunar communication and with the Earth. So there is an institutional, military, industrial ecosystem geared towards the moon. Of course, there are budget challenges and constraints, and General Adam mentioned the fact that French public opinion likes astronauts flying around the Earth but not paying for it. It's the same in Italy, it's the same in large part of Europe, but it's not black and white. I mean, there are ways to invest on space. The Italian government used 3.3 billion of the next generation EU loans by the European Union after the pandemic to invest on space technologies. And it was a wise investment in my view. And this investment, and this here I come to the last part of Claude Fron's question, is really a balancing act between transatlantic, European, and national dimension. And this is pretty much in line with Italian traditional foreign and defense policy. Italy is strongly committed in European Space Agency program. It is committed in EU program, but if there is no just retour, like in Aris Square for the Italian companies, then Italy is less committed in a EU project that was output seems to be unfair in industrial terms. So you see nuances in that. But Italy has also managed to maintain good cooperation on space, despite the tensions, the problems, the challenges brought by the Trump administration across the board. So the Italian military is still in the Combined Space Operations Center, led by the US Space Force. And while the Artemis Accords are really in trouble, Gateway has been mentioned, Italy went for a bilateral deal with the US on cooperation, technological, scientific, on the moon. It was not an easy choice because Italy is more keen to multilateral cooperation, trilateral, quadrilateral, the group of like-minded, like Artemis, but better than nothing, it kept this bilateral accord. And the presence of Parmitano, of course, is his merit as an astronaut, but it's also a shared merit with the Italian Space Agency, the Italian Air Force, who train him and cooperates with the US Space Force, and the Meloni government. Because you cannot really disconnect the space policy from foreign policy, defense policy, industrial policy. And the stability of this government helped to make the best of the meaningful but limited political resources, military resources, economic resources that Italy had, and that had a good impact on this cooperation. I stop here. I have a number of doubts on the future of the Artemis Accord and the moon race, but I'll leave that for a second round of question. Thank you.
Yes, it's agreed that we'll come back to the question and perhaps less easy issues, considering what we could traditionally consider as safe and reliable and what is now more shaky or whimsical from our big partner. Then now we could have begun with a legal issue, but and we would be very grateful if you could, Christopher, give us some more light on precisely the legal issues on the status of lunar governance. Well, traditionally, beyond the existing legal text, discussions on space in general took place in the UN framework. Well, now we have some blockage on many issues. And how do you see the governance level at international in the international sphere? And I would add, what are the most pressing near-term issues in lunar governance that we should focus on? And if you want to add, but it could be in the second moment, some Dutch.
Oh,
Because it's interesting also to see the way, well, traditionally Germany and Italy are big, very big players in the field of space. Netherlands is relevant, but not as a big player. Then, and it's interesting to see there was a kind at a certain moment of disinvestment on behalf of the Netherlands, and then a few years ago, more interest and more priority given to space. And how, if you can say a word on that, that would be also of interest for you, for us.
Yes, certainly. We can take it up in the next round of questions. Although, you know, as a spoiler, I would be speaking about the power of middle power states and their efficacy and autonomy to develop norms. So, but to answer your first question, and first, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Johnson. I'm a professor of law at Leiden University, teaching air and space law, and I'm a late substitute for this panel. So I invite your indulgence as I struggle with some of the
welcome.
Yeah. But I am coming also this afternoon from Vienna, where I was attending the 69th session of the United Nations Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space down in Vienna. So I'm also very grateful for the warmth of the June heat here in Paris, and the warmth of my new friends and colleagues here at Ifri. I have been attending COPUOS. And when we speak about, you know, the answer to your question of when we think about lunar governance and the development of lunar governance, the headline that I would give you, as you should expect it, is polycentric. It's a polycentric system, meaning norm development, norm socialization at many different nodes across the international system, whether it's through the offices of the UN, whether it's outside of the UN, where it's done at national levels by national regulators, or even whether it is industry standards or commercial actors who are developing notions and norms and standards to try and socialize those. But to begin at this top level, what I've seen happening at the United Nations, and I don't want to turn this conference into a lecture on space law, but I invite you to sit and read the Outer Space Treaty, spend some time thinking about what it contains, what it says, and what it doesn't say. This is, you know, something which was developed at United Nations Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space 60 years ago in 1966, and coming up on the 60th anniversary of the Outer Space Treaty, open for signature January 27th, 1967. So that anniversary is coming up. We have that when we think about the Outer Space Treaty as this Magna Carta, this major document on principles for outer space. We can speak a little bit more about the Moon Agreement, 1979 Moon Agreement, which entered into force in 1984. A whole lot less numerous parties to the Moon Agreement. The Netherlands is a party to the Moon Agreement and the Outer Space Treaty and the Artemis Accords. And France is a signatory to the Moon Agreement, but has not ratified it, although I hear that it is thinking of ratifying the Moon Agreement. We can have a further discussion about that. So there's discussion about the Moon Agreement, and then the Artemis Accords, as you've heard a whole lot about, which are not a treaty. They are a non-binding political declaration, intentionally not created as a treaty, which honestly, 90% of the Artemis Accords just reiterates what is in the Outer Space Treaty. But almost 70 states parties have signed on to the Artemis Accords. So when we think about lunar governance, we're beginning with the Outer Space Treaty. What does it say? What doesn't it say? What guidance does it give us? Of course, you've heard of the non-appropriation principle. The moon and other celestial bodies is not subject to national appropriation by claims of sovereignty, by means of use or occupation, or by any other means. So that non-appropriation principle doesn't prohibit national appropriation. It makes it impossible. If you are to make a claim of sovereignty, your act of claim of sovereignty is legally void. It has no effect. By means of use, occupation, any other means. Quite wisely drafted by the framed by the drafters to create it as a principle. It is impossible to appropriate, to nationally appropriate, or for the territorial annexation of parts of the moon. But balanced against that, because treaties balance rights and obligations, balanced against that is Article 1, the great freedoms of exploration and use. And so for decades, there has been debate about whether we can use space resources. I witnessed those debates develop at the United Nations, and the dawning slowly on everyone was, oh, if we want to go to space for long periods of time, we need to use the resources of space. We can't take all the water we're going to drink in space from the third planet from the sun if we can find water in those celestial locations. So that our understanding of freedom of exploration and use in Article 1 allows us to use those, allows us and agrees, it has everyone agreeing that we can use space resources. That is reiterated in the Artemis Accords, and that is also being reiterated at a newer development at the United Nations. There's the Space Resources Working Group, chaired by Stephen Freeland of Australia. They're developing, even right now, the draft principles, which are going to be permissive for the use of space resources. That document that they create, I'll predict, is not going to be a new treaty. We're not going to have a new treaty for space resources, but we will have something which develops at the United Nations at COPUOS with 116 states parties to the Outer Space Treaty and over 100 members of COPUOS, which says, yes, we can indeed use resources. We've spent a lot of time thinking about space resources and how attractive they are to use, but there are, I would say, nearer term issues in space governance and in lunar governance, even before the use of space resources. So we also have at the UN the Action Team on Lunar Activities Consultation, the ATLAC. And the ATLAC is, as I just said, Lunar Activities Consultation. Article 11, the Outer Space Treaty. We have to engage in consultations. So that working group is looking at how we do information sharing, what that information sharing looks like. I really encourage you to read Article 11, which obliges states to share information. And why, if we're going to the moon, would we be sharing information? It's so that other actors know what we're up to and can respond and coordinate their activities accordingly. Article 11 is tied to Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty. If you're sharing information of where you're going, I'm under a duty to show you cooperation, mutual assistance, due regard, and to engage in international consultations should harmful interference be threatened, and to avoid harmful interference. So you share information with what you're doing on the moon so that the other actors can respond in a way which is responsible, which is tied to their interests as well. So I've mentioned the Space Resources Working Group. I mentioned the ATLAC. Interestingly, and this is, I think, a nearer term opportunity for cooperation, it's cislunar PNT, position, navigation, and timing, how we tell time and how we navigate on the moon. That is not specifically done within COPUOS, it's done within the ICG, the International Committee on GNSS. And the ICG last year established a lunar working group to look at how ILRS, the Chinese-Russian program, Russian-Chinese-led program, and how Artemis program will coordinate, let's say, or at least be interoperable in the frequencies that they use when they're going to the moon. This is tied not to their own desire to be benevolent and share information with the rest of the world. It's tied to their own interests of mission assurance. Actor A will share what frequencies they're using, moon to orbit, orbit to moon, moon, rover, station to rover. They'll share what frequencies they're using because they want other actors to know what frequencies they're using so they don't cause harmful interference. So this is that sharing of information is tied to mission assurance, and it's tied to essentially just capacity building and consultations. So the ICG working group on cislunar PNT. And for everything else, or a lot of other things are also happening at the ITU in terms of they've already determined what types of frequencies they will use for orbital operations and cislunar operations that are not specific to PNT. So those are what's happening at the UN, and I've mentioned a number of different groups. As I said, we're relying on scientists to come up with solutions, but we're also looking to what is politically possible, what states can agree to. I think I've seen more traction at this, the Space Resources Working Group, because it's easier for states to agree to their rights. It's easier for them to show up in a committee and say, I think we have this right, and I think we have this additional right. It's a little bit more difficult to have them speaking about their obligations and their commitments, but so it takes longer, but it is possible. I think I'll leave it at that, though.
And if I may, what you say that considering the geopolitical situation and separation between well, what the United States and the European do on one side, what China and Russia on the other side, and other players in between or elsewhere, you consider that nevertheless it functions for the reason you give. That is, there is a national interest, a very operational interest even in cooperating in some issues. Then you are kind of reassuring about the fact that despite the fact that, for instance, the Security Council is blocked, the working groups on space nevertheless go on and progress.
Yeah, I mean, what I've seen as an observer for over a decade, almost 15, 16 years going to COPUOS, is at the higher level, geopolitics interferes. There's, of course, we see this in Geneva as well. You know, there's, yeah, you know, geopolitics interferes with the discussions. There's walkouts, there's rights of reply. But when it goes into the working groups, where the actors actually get together and say, this is what I'm doing, this is, I know this is what you're doing. Let's come up with something which is actionable, because they know those, they know the delegations on the other side. So honestly, at a lower working group level, I see progress. It is slower because that's how the way the UN works. And as COPUOS gets larger and larger, it is slower. But yeah, I'll leave it at that. I think I do see progress on space resources within the ATLAC. It is, of course, constrained by larger postures by states in terms of whether they want to see the development of new treaties, and some major states do not, and that's accepted. And they say, okay, well, if we're not going to work on new treaties, there's a whole lot we can still work on, including articulating how we will share information, and articulating what, you know, the mechanisms for sharing that information. And you will say your ideas for best practices in lunar activity. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Then now to come to again, perhaps more independent presentation on issues that you have raised. First thing I would say that what has been for me very striking in your presentation is that I was trying in my questions to be focused on science and exploration, but both of you put it very clearly in the larger framework of strategic space policy, industrial interest, military interest. And I think it's honest to do that. And to come back to the initial question that you raised, General, we know, well, it's not the object of today's discussion, but what is at stake in the military field, in the security, space situational awareness, access, and by the way, access to space being not only a question of launching capabilities, but also a question of being able in the low orbiter to survive, considering everything that will be there. And in the next, well, we already said exponential 10 years ago, but now it's exponentially exponential. Then considering all that, do you think that there is a strategic interest and a clear industrial interest, not only influence or power or prestige, but really strategic interest, technological interest and industrial interest of having a place in, let's say, the moon race to make it more spectacular? And how would you see the German position vis-a-vis that? And you said, both of you also, that while it's traditionally the Italian policy and the German policy to consider the transatlantic cooperation as central, kind of colonne vertebrale. backbone. And considering, again, the present situation, you just think that we should wait? It's a particularly strange moment, but it's suddenly at a certain level and things won't go well at a lower level or at the real level of forces, military, scientists, legal people. Or do you think that we will have, for plenty of reasons, and not only the whimsical personality of X or Y, we will have a real possibility of diverging interests and risks linked with that with our big American partner? And not the German or the Italian position, but again, your position as expert. It's even an easier question.
Should I start?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. That was two very complex questions. And I think regarding the strategic dimension of our inputs, both for Alesandro and me, it's probably given our background, since we focus so much on security and defense, but also what we see when we look at what is happening in the United States, what is happening in China, what was and still is happening in Russia, but also in other parts of the world. You mentioned middle powers. Let's not forget about India, for instance, or Japan or South Korea in this regard. I think you can really see that not just space, but as an extended form of space. Sometimes for it I think it's still hard to imagine because so much focus right now is on Earth orbits and how we get, as you mentioned, access, but also, mass and capabilities up there. But I think when you look at the debates taking place in the United States, but also in China, as far as you can tell that in terms of transparency, space and also the moon are becoming a next strategic frontier. They're becoming a strategic domain. And I think for a very long time, this is certainly true, very much true for Germany. We did not really grasp this kind of strategic relevance. We were really late to the party. In a way, Europe as well. I think in Europe, concentration was also very much on technology, on governance aspects, on industrial aspects, scientific aspects. And this also changed recently, that we started to see the space domain, and by extension also, the moon and the cislunar space as essential for our own strategic autonomy. And I know we have an intense debate about that between France and Germany all the time. But I think in this regard, also Germany has come closer to France in a way, signaling that, or meaning that we are aware of what's happening in the transatlantic relationship. And I wouldn't put that just on the person sitting in the White House, but we see the strategic interest between Europe and the United States diverging, which I think can be okay in a partnership if you talk about how you can manage then these diverging interests in the right setting and certainly in the right diplomatic tone. When it comes to our own European strategic interests in the moon and the cislunar space, I think this is still not at the forefront. So when you look at different strategy papers, there's still very little mention of what is happening with regard to the moon and also with regard to cislunar space. But once again, you talk or you listen to what, for instance, members of the US Space Force tell about the moon and the cislunar space, you see that they are way more embedded in the strategic competition, which I think does not dominate our thinking yet, but we're still, no matter the less, we are feeling the consequences of this strategic competition. When we talk about what kind of position Europe can take in this geopolitical climate, I think for us it's important to acknowledge that the moon and the cislunar space are becoming a strategic domain in their own rights, and that anybody in this kind of geopolitical climate wants to have some kind of way to shape the strategic environment. And from a European point of view, of course, this has certain implications. So you have certain factors that go into how can you shape from a European point of view the debate about the discourse, the governance aspects of this sphere of interest. I think when it comes to the moon, and this is something that perhaps might be, also sometimes due to how it is portrayed in the media, the moon race, who gets to be first back on the moon. There's a tight race between the United States and China and other actors. But when it comes to really shaping the environment, it's about infrastructure. It's about, being able to be there in a sustained manner. So it's not so much about who is going to be there first, but who will be able to have a sustained presence there. And of course, this is also tied, if we want to be autonomous as Europe in a way. And of course, here we are back to the problem. What is Europe? How do we define our fragmented approach to space? We need also to think about infrastructure. What can we bring to the table in this regard? Chris has mentioned, and I was very grateful for your insights from the UN bodies in this regard, that of course, if Europe wants to shape the strategic environment, we have to have capabilities to know what is going on there. Meaning we have to think about better space situational awareness. We have also to think about space traffic management, which is, I think, a core European endeavor in a way, because missions to the moon, to the cislunar space will increase, and you can see this run. And so that's why it's important to know what is going on there. So that means we have to be better aware of what is happening there. And this needs more technological sophistication. I think Europe is very well positioned because we have great science, we have great research, we have great industrial capabilities in regards. Also, when we think about the moon and the cislunar space as a strategic domain, and this is the same thing that pertains to perhaps space systems positioned in Earth orbits, is we have to think about resilience, because the more actors are involved there, the more objects are being sent to this particular sphere around the moon. There might be harmful interference, there might be collisions, there might be accidents, space debris. So we have to think about resilience, in a way that we have to harden our systems. So once we think about infrastructure, we have to think about how can we harden them against certain threats, being on an accidental basis, but also since we see a proliferation of counter space technologies and tactics, we also have to think about, as I said, harmful or hostile interference. And also coming from a European point of view, and this is not just with regard to space, but also any other aspects when it comes to technology and defense, also in our transatlantic relationship, when you want to have a say about governance, about how you can shape the environment, how you can shape the norms and principles that will be pertaining to the moon and to the cislunar space, you need to have operational capabilities, because governance without capabilities does not carry as much weight as it should have. Right now, what we see in this geopolitical climate is more or less, when you talk about a race, it's all about different geopolitical actors trying to position themselves early on in a very good position. And so you also have, you have a lot of actors counting on first mover advantages to shape how we talk about, how we behave in space. And so, of course, if we want to be part of that discussion, we need necessary capabilities to be part of that. So lastly, when we talk then about what does it mean for Europe in terms of priorities, where should we steer our policies towards? I think looking at different approaches within Europe, of course, I think we first have to define what is our strategic interest in the moon? What is our strategic interest in the cislunar space? It does not have to be a strategy paper, which is not implemented. But I think it should be the basis to really have a coherent approach within Europe on what kind of technologies should we have, where do we not want, or where don't we want to be dependent on the United States? What can we do? What can everybody from Europe bring to the table to that? So I think when you think about a more coherent approach to the moon and the cislunar space, it's really necessary for us to not just overcome our fragmentation when it comes to institutions, when it comes to our industries, but once again, when it comes to how we approach space in this setting. A second priority, of course, would be capabilities. I mentioned that. With regard to space situational awareness, PNT was already mentioned. Of course, access, being able to go there alone is one priority that we also have, but also in terms of logistics, in terms of robotics, in terms of autonomous systems, where Europe really has a great potential that it can bring to the table. And Alesandro certainly mentioned industrial capabilities. When we look what is happening in the United States, we see that the Artemis program is heavily depending on commercial actors, which of course has its disadvantages and its challenges. But I think the Draghi report is very clear that with the commercialization of space, we also will have to increase our space industrial policy, or in the space industrial industry in this regard, which can be a benefit. But of course, you need policies, and I liked what you said about, it's not just space policy, it's industrial policy, and I think we really need to understand it as well in this regard. And I think then, and this is from a German point of view, it's not about really, can we be dependent of the United States? Because I think, at least me as a German researcher, I know we cannot be for the foreseeable future. But I think we can really be a more interesting partner if we bring more to the table in terms of capabilities. I know that might be not very convincing to a French audience.
Claudia, I think there is a problem of sound.
Okay, I'm so sorry. So to the audience, I said a lot of interesting things. I'm so sorry that you could not hear that, but I'd stop at that. Thank you.
I will suggest, sorry, Alessandro and Christopher, if your answer can be short, because I would like, well, first to finish in due time for the next session, but also to give the floor to people in the room who certainly have a lot of questions, and as short as possible, and sorry.
Let me make a synthesis. The scientific exploration aspects are really important because space is both national interest, security interest, economic interest. Look at what is access to space for France with Ariane, and what is it for Italy with Avio and Vega. But it's also aspirational. It's symbolic. It's something that motivates engineers, scientists, astronauts, military. I mean, when we had Luca Parmitano or Samantha Cristoforetti at my institute for an Astro Talk, it was a boom because it's something that motivates. Let's think about Kennedy's speech about why the US went to the moon. So this element of exploration is not mutually exclusive with the elements of national interest and national security. They're two sides of the same coin with regard to space. So I want to stress this because it's there, it's true, and it's important. I think there's going to be a competition in the moon, on the moon, in cislunar security between China, with Russia in a weak position that will have to side more and more with China because of its own weaknesses. I don't have time to elaborate on that, but my colleague Carolina Muti published just this week a report on EI website on non-European space powers and the lessons for Europe. And one of the lessons for Europe is that while the number of spacefaring nations is increasing, China, India, Japan, Canada, many partners of the Artemis Accords are in the game to learn how to play the game of space exploration, become more autonomous. Lesson for Europe is that Europe, in my view, is a space power. It can act as a space power if there is more integration among member states, institutions, and industry. And the aspirational side, it's there. The symbolic side is there. The astronauts are there. Hopefully, the integration of the space division of Airbus, Thales, and Leonardo into a single space European company, space European champion, could be a trigger for integration industrial, but not only industrial. On the transatlantic relation, very briefly, Italy is adjusting to that. It's not the same transatlantic Italy of 2 years ago, of course, because it's not just Trump, it's beyond the Trump administration. So Italy is taking stock of that. Is not going for a Starlink service for the Italian institution. This was an opening 1 year ago to ease transatlantic tension, but it's not going to fly. We're going to have either a European solution or another national solution. The point is that with less trust in the US, with less transatlantic cooperation, Italy, as other European country, is turning more European, but also more national. And if each of us turn more national, at the end of the day, we will be less European because we go for a fragmentation on a national basis, also space. And this is something to avoid. This is not to say that transatlantic cooperation on space is dead. At the end of the day, even the Russians and the Americans cooperated on the International Space Station during the Cold War. So I think that the Americans and the Europeans can cooperate as well on the moon. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. If you agree, I will ask directly for question, and probably there will be a lot of questions on the way you. And well, I felt sure that there would be many questions.
First one is always the hardest.
Allez, Gérard Brachet.
Merci, Paul. Yeah.
Qui a dirigé le CNES.
Yeah, I have to volunteer because nobody dares to ask a question. You were referring to cooperation on the ISS. This did not happen during the Cold War. The Cold War was over when the ISS developed. It became, in fact, the ISS because the Cold War was over. So, slight correction to your historical reference. But the main point that we are facing here today is to what extent the European member states, which is a fuzzy concept because the UK is a member state of ESA, but it's not a member state of EU and so on. But I include the UK in my thinking. Whether the European member states are willing to put real money into sovereign access to space for their own astronauts. I mean, it boils down to all that. And today the answer is no. But tomorrow, my expectation is that the answer will be yes. Because and this is independently of the share that they will take into the moon exploration in cooperation of the US. The question of independent access to space for manned space has been on the table, or should say maybe under the table, for quite a long time. And Europe has not been able to agree on a significant investment in there. I think the time has come for a decision to be taken. I know, and Alesandro Marrone explained that very well, because it corresponds to an aspiration of the layman in the street. The guy in the street reacts to seeing is a national astronaut in space. It's a very national perspective, by the way. But anyway, it is a fact. And it is a fact that many scientists do not actually take into account because there is no scientific motivation for all that. I mean, no big discovery has been made at the ISS. If there was one, we would know about it. So the ISS, from a scientific point of view, is a pure waste of money. But from the point of view of being a symbol of capability and a symbol of what man and woman can do in space, it carries a lot of weight. And for this reason, some decision will be taken, and I think you probably will agree with that.
If I can add something, that we will have a lot of money. My well, the first director of the European Defence Agency, Nick Whitney, said after the decision taken in NATO, 3.5 and 5%, said too much, too fast. And he explained that we would use the money in an inappropriate way, stupidly, not the proper capabilities and not to support EDT, European technological basis. Then there will be a lot of money on space, and you mentioned particularly the immense sum of money in Germany, and voila, and which can go on because there is the economic situation and the financial situation is what it is. Then we have this rationale that Gerard Brachet mentioned, and at the same time, we will have at least at the EU level and national level, particularly, to be honest, Germany, an enormous sum of money. Should we, including for the symbolic reason mentioned by Gerard Brachet, des astronautes, European astronauts, spend part of this money on the moon, on the race to the moon? That's for you. Any of you would answer.
I'll say to start the discussion, I think it's very important for actors, for the folks in the audience to understand and deconstruct. It isn't Europe doing things in space. It's choosing to do planetary sciences or heliophysics or lunar exploration or Earth observation. There are different priorities for each member state to say like, oh, we actually care a whole lot more about Earth observation. We're going to put more money into that. And if there's a finite amount, maybe it's going to have to be detracted from, say, deep space missions, mission to an asteroid, heliophysics, et cetera. So this is why, and I'll leave it for the policy experts to really dig into national priorities across Europe and say, these countries have a long-term interest in, say, to get back to the moon, a long-term interest in space sciences, planetary exploration, moon exploration. And briefly, because you asked this question earlier, why is geopolitics different when we get to the moon? It's soft power. If you can get your astronaut to the moon, there's tremendous soft power wins. So while states may be thinking about, oh, there's commerce which can happen, there's sciences which can happen, I think for the near term, it will be the soft power diplomatic firsts and wins that they will be able to brag about, which might even override those science interests and commerce interests. So that's one reason why the moon is going to be different. In addition to, as I see they're still writing their answers out, in addition to what I was going to say before is also, let's think about the moon. 384,000 kilometers away from the Earth, 3 days travel. It is look at the image of it. It is a lifeless environment with no atmosphere, 1/6 gravity, cosmic background radiation, micrometeoroids. How is geopolitics different in that environment? In an environment where it is a challenge to keep humans alive, it is a challenge to keep your system even working, and where it is a challenge because the lunar regolith is like finely ground glass, like diamonds. So as you try and do anything on the moon, the regolith itself is grinding your material, grinding your infrastructure, and making it very, very difficult to do anything. So in that environment, what do geopolitics look like when the near side always faces us, the far side always faces away? 14 days of daylight, 14 days of nighttime, temperature swings between negative 130 Celsius to to positive 150 Celsius at equatorial regions. Whereas at the lunar South Pole, there are places that have not received sunlight for billions of years, and other places that receive sunlight, these peaks of eternal light, maybe 80 to 90% of the time. What does geopolitics look like in that environment? When we send astronauts to that environment, I think that the challenge of keeping your mission sustainable and the challenge of keeping your humans alive, and maybe even the soft power wins, if you could come to the aid of another state, if they're in trouble, the soft power wins from that changes all the dynamics of geopolitics. It's not geopolitics, it's like lunar politics. So I'll leave it at that.
very interesting point. Access to space. If I can rephrase Houston, we have a problem. I would say Kourou, we have a problem, meaning that, I see the point of access to space as a national interest, as a strategic priority. I see also the link with nuclear deterrence, but we cannot shy from technological innovation and just subsidize the current state-of-the-art technology because we want an autonomous access to space. We had to take the risk of a change of technological paradigm because otherwise the European private sector is going to finance US technological innovation because private users, but also institutional users, launches with SpaceX because it's cheaper, it's reliable, and it takes place every few weeks. So we have to, move beyond the dichotomy. Okay, it's not commercially valuable, but it's strategic, so we finance. We have to find a way to have something that is strategic. We found it, but it has also a business case. We cannot rely only on public investment on that for the long term. I absolutely agree with the point on soft power made by my colleague. But let me push a bit forward, and this is the science fiction nerd in me talking to you. I mean, Earth observation, satellite communication, position navigation timing, it's today critical dependencies of European armed forces, European intelligence, European institutions from the US, and we want to fill the gap and to be more autonomous. And I agree partially with Andrea, we cannot be completely autonomous, but between 0% and 100%, if we can move up closer to 100%, it's better and it's doable in some areas or to some degree. So it's not black and white, it's 50 shades of gray. But these are the current vulnerabilities. If we don't take the risk of being part of the moon race, in a few decades, my two sons will attend a conference talking about European dependence on US or Chinese on-orbit logistic and service from Earth to moon and back. Again, this is science fiction, but many things have been science fiction for decades and now they are real. So there may well be the case of not geopolitical, but of national interest case for moon exploration, that now it's on paper, but it does not take that many years to turn from paper to reality. And if Europe is late, it will be late also on this, as in many other fields. 2 years ago, it happened to me to write a piece with Samantha Cristoforetti, with the astronaut, with the title, Fly Me to the Moon, Europe has to be part of the moon race. That piece was written for the NATO Defense College because we linked the scientific, technological, aspirational part with the security part and with, it was 2024, so before the Trump election, with a more balanced transatlantic relation. And that's, again, it's part of the picture of greater European autonomy to space without putting a limit to low Earth orbit, but including also the cislunar security.
Thank you, since you also raised the question regarding Germany. I absolutely agree with the inspirational factor and the soft power aspect of that. But coming, from Germany, of course, when you have, or, thinking in being a political decision makers, having to, talk about the space budget, inspirational might attract talent, but it's hard to justify immense sums if your economy is struggling. So I absolutely agree with that. But I think, in terms of the geopolitical competition taking place, several aspects, I think, come to the forefront in our debate. With regard to Germany, you mentioned the 35 billion that Germany is spending on space, which is, I think, purely military, which is, I think, about 3 times as much as France is spending in the same period of time. But it's important to not forget that we are starting from a different position. So there's a lot of catching up to do in this regard. And of course, we should be also have the foresight, as Alessandro said, to be more engaged in this moon race, to have this strategic foresight, which we so often lack in Europe and in Germany. But especially from a German point of view, we still have to make our homework, as you said, with regard to our own space situational awareness, our own secure SATCOM systems, with regard to our own PNT and ISR capabilities. So I think, although there's a lot of money now going into our system, I'd like for us to have, to do our homeworks on the essential capability gaps that we're lacking so far. When it comes to this debate in Germany, you can see a few people are pushing. It's not really the political decision makers, but it's in part the military, because they see the strategic importance of the moon and the cislunar space, and industry. So we have industry pushing because they see, of course, the industrial benefits and the advantages and the opportunity in this regard. And we're also spending 5.4 billion also to NASA, with a certain regard to, with a certain percentage also pertaining to the moon. So while I understand that we need way more money to go into the moon race, I think from a German point of view, we first have to do our homework, which might be, once again, too little too late when it comes, to having the strategic foresight. But I would not want to deviate our discussion that we're having, because this is also something very particular to the German debate, to deviate attention from the things that need to be done to talk about other things as well.
Yes, thank you.
Maybe you can ask each question after the other and take several.
I will take the 4 of them.
Okay. So thank you. My name is Serge Platard, and it's a question and a comment. And I would like to articulate what I'm going to say around a couple of words: strategy, which is central, vision, budgets, and risks. So all the expose we have received, of course, touch upon those issues. But as a European, we have a major issue. Do we consider, as probably the US does and China, that we have to look at the Earth, at circumterrestrial orbits and the moon as an ecosystem, as a unique system, and you have to deal with this system for the reasons you have explained, basically very strategic reasons. I'm not sure today that the Europeans have this vision and their interest in admitting that they have to embark in this kind of concept. Second, we have the budget. And the budget, we know the figures, and we don't have the budget to do that properly at the scale that China and the US is doing it. So this is absolutely a major issue. And 3, we have to compete these interests for these lunar and cislunar regions compared to, I would say, space infrastructures, the type of Starlink and other European Iris Square, etc., which is so painful to take off. We relearn Galileo after 20 years. It's absolutely dreadful, but it was just a parenthesis. So we have to deal with this because I think those low Earth orbit infrastructures are central, or medium Earth infrastructure are central. It pumps a lot of money. So we have less money for what we're today in this room. So my question and my wondering is, how can we accommodate for that? I don't think we cut corners. And if our role at the end of the day is to be part of a tiny bit mission or program of access to the moon and staying on the moon, exploring the moon, exploring the cislunar and I would say orbits, we won't be part of the game. We are not going to be in the driving seat. We're going to be, as the Americans say, they will continue with the Chinese probably do the cooking, and we're going to do the cleaning. And so it's a question of priority. We, as an entity, as Europeans, including the UK, Gerard, of course, we have the ability to make a decision. Today, we're unable to make the decision at the proper scale, but we could do it. So this is really the issue.
Hi. My name is Emma Dickinson. I'm a university student. I'm doing a program with Sciences Po here, and I had a question about how you perceive the role of entrepreneurship or actors basically specifically denying a threat or issue or potentially not offering concrete suggestions within the international arena as, I guess, influencing the UN or, as you mentioned, like geopolitics interfering with the Trump administration or other potential diverging goals. And if you have any potential examples of a negotiation or a treaty where you can pinpoint specific states as, I guess, utilizing that in terms of furthering their own advantage by essentially doing nothing.
Hi, hello everyone. Following on the question and comment from Serge. Bonjour Serge, Claire Joly. So I'm Claire Joly, I'm with the OECD, leading the work on the space economy. So I have a question on the economics of it all. And that goes back indeed to some of the questions that came up and the budgets that are needed to conduct moon exploration. We've had the experience with the ISS, where a number of industry players and as well a number of countries suggested that the involvement of the ISS actually diverted some needed investments in space towards human space flight. So there was a big debate for a number of decades on this. So the big question about this moon race would indeed be more interesting for a number of industry players to indeed find their ways into some of the value chains, the supply chains, instead of having large investments from governments in such exploration programs when I would say that the budgets are actually being restricted for civil space in quite a number of countries. Thanks for this.
Thanks so much for your presentation. So my name is Mike and I'm a Sciences Po student. I would like to ask a question about European partnership and cooperation. So as you mentioned, we have a tremendous potential of cooperation potential, but market laws and political divisions act as a glass ceiling. A recent example is Dassault and Airbus cooperation failure and the joint military, one of the most ambitious joint military cooperations. So I would like to know, what do you think, how could we develop our partnership, our cooperation in Europe, and thus reinforce European soft power?
Latest. A bit before would be better.
Pick the questions to which you want to answer, and I tell you already, I won't try to summarize our discussion. I think it would be pointless, and because also there will be our last session. I think it will also be questioned. Then at least we will win some time on the fact that I won't speak at length at the end of the. Who wants to address what which of the four questions? Yes, please.
I mean, I'd like to start maybe with Claire Joly's question about economics, and I think that maybe the answer, if I understood your question correctly, I think my answer is going to be, commercial services and infrastructure. The commercial industry will look at what nation states, groups of nation states, and also what the science community wants to do on the moon. If you want to, build a radio astronomy or observatory someplace on the moon, it's the commercial industry who's going to supply that. It's also the commercial industry that will take part in Artemis program, goods, services, infrastructure, power, navigation, communications. I think it's all of that. It's initially government facing, and then at some point in the future, hopefully it's business to business. Hopefully that answers your question in a general sense is how I see it. And then that also hopefully goes a little bit towards your question as well, and you're in the front.
Okay, 3 points to you and to the OECD colleague. First, as Italy is partnering UK and Japan on the Global Combat a program for next generation aircraft, I'm not allowed to comment on the failure of SCAF. We want to be fair. I wanted just to point out that some cooperation among European countries with Japan is still going on and it's promising. Sorry for that, but I cannot resist to make this point because of the question. No, seriously, I think that in the space sector, the current change of paradigm in the US presents such a probability of putting European space companies out of the commercial market, not only out of the US market, but out of the global market and even out of the European market. Because when you have the Italian operation, Trenitalia, the Italian railway company, using Starlink services, it's a critical infrastructure, it's participated by the government, and it's using Starlink. So if the European space sector doesn't have a quantum leap, it risks to really lose its own market, commercial, and rely only on public subsidies. So to me, this is a driver for industrial and political tough choices on sharing sovereignty, sharing investment, and sharing program, because it's not the same space sector worldwide of 10 years ago. And it's not temporary, it's a structural change, and we have to adjust or being misplaced. On the economic aspect, the jury is open. I mean, you may be right on the fact that European suppliers may work with the SpaceX, with the Blue Origin, with Chinese prime contractor or others. But I wonder whether this is sufficient in terms of skills, talents, industrial base, without being the system integrator, without having the design authority of new technologies, without being part of the new frontier of on-orbit service or on-orbit logistics, you may call it as you want. I mean, the ability to move, to operate, to do maintenance, to move payloads, but also humans in space, etc., etc. And there is going to be a business case for that. Not now, but there's going to be a business case. So for that level of ambition, in economic industrial terms, you need some champions and you need some flagship program. From a political institution point of view, it's absolutely necessary, exactly for the point made on strategic autonomy and the role of Europe towards its own interest. But even in economic terms, I wonder, I'm not sure whether being a subcontractor is enough for a continent of 500 million population, 22% of GDP worldwide, etc., an industrialized continent, not an agriculture continent, or not only an agricultural continent.
The first one and the last one. I'll be very brief. I absolutely agree with you with regard to priorities, and we need a vision. But with regard to priorities, when we look at European security in general, you know that better than I do probably, we are between a rock and a hard spot. We are facing a tremendous threat from Russia. We are experiencing a new adjustment in the transatlantic relationship, and this more or less of the years of peace dividend, where of course, you know, priorities get shaped more at the time being not so much by vision, but by military need, at least from a German point of view. When we talk about the commercial sector regarding your question, I think, and there has been a really great report by the European Space Policy Institute about financing, how our European defense new space industry is being financed. And I think about 60% of startups in Germany are being financed by US investors, since we lack the private capital in this regard. France, I think, is doing pretty well in terms of national investment, but of course, when you look at the scale, it's minimal. So it's really not competitive. But also what we see, and this is where I think our governments come in, where we really need a budget. But when we look at SpaceX and what it has become, this would not have been possible without public money by the government. So we still need the state as an anchor customer in this regard. So we are facing several challenges. We need public spending, we need the state anchor as a customer, but to bring our commercial sector to certain valleys of death in terms of innovation, we need private investment. And this is where we're certainly lacking. And I don't think that from a European point of view, we're offering the best framework in terms of bureaucracy, in terms of fragmentation. So I think what Alesandro said, in a way, we need to have a really broad perspective on looking on our defense or in our space sector and see, okay, how can we attract more money, but also how can our companies get reliability by our government spending in this regard. And with regard to your question, sometimes I question myself, what else has to happen? I mentioned Russia, I mentioned the transatlantic relationship. Sometimes I just, from an outside think tank perspective, I'm like, what else has to happen for Europe to finally get its grip together in a way? It was actually a French expert in this regard, which made, I think, a very great recommendation when we talk about how we can organize European common development of capabilities. We should think first about the capabilities and not about the workload, the national workloads. And I think, especially when it comes to FCAS, in this regard, we should not over-politicize everything. In a way, I think at a certain point, things got so over-politicized that it made it really hard. But, think from the capability side and not from the national workload. I found that a very good recommendation.
And I'm thinking more about Serge's question about vision and about whether European member states or Europe in general has a shared vision or an articulated vision for the moon, for cislunar, what its plans are. First, it begins with understanding what the opportunities are. And there isn't just science opportunities, there's various sciences opportunities on the moon, whether it's planetary science. Would Europe like to figure out how old the moon is and how it formed? Whether it's astronomy, lunar crater radio telescope on the far side, whether it's astrobiology, search for extraterrestrial life, there's science opportunities on the moon. And which of those opportunities would Europe like to be a major player in that? And what equities, what stakeholders would be interested in that? Additionally, there's the exploration and development. Well, let's say the development, economic development opportunities or commercial opportunities on the moon. As I said, that's also interesting to think about of where it may be in the short term, near term. I think it is services, infrastructure, communications. The last few commercial missions to the moon failed. Why did they fail? They got all the way to the moon. They landed on the moon, then the rovers tipped over. Because it's quite hard to land on the moon. Because the terrain was not stable. Because the gravity at the moon is difficult. It's different. It's not homogeneous at the moon. So even like a landing pad on the moon is a near-term goal for really everyone. We would need a shared landing pad. There's also opportunities for like dust mitigation. Takeoff, landing, you're kicking up a lot of regolith. So there's economic activities. How would Europe and European countries like to take part in that, in addition to all those soft power things? The soft power goals, which really cannot be overstated as something quite attractive. I wanted to say before, lastly, about autonomy or independence. At the moon, no one will be independent for quite a long time. We will all be interdependent at the moon. And I mean, essentially, we're all developing countries when it comes to lunar activities and lunar spacefaring. We're all trying to figure out and knowing how difficult it is just to get there and be successful in your mission.
Well, thank you very much to all of you. And thank you also for the question. And sorry if we did not answer in the detail to all the questions. Really, many thanks to the panel. Now we will have an American voice. And what you discussed, in a way, are a lot of questions to our American partner. Of course, all of you said the same thing. We like cooperation in a transatlantic framework, but it must be reliable, and it must ensure that we are neither free riders nor spectators or dependent, even if it's coming from a very high level of dependency to more 200% non-dependency. But then now the voice is to our American partner.
Thank you very much. So for the last segment of our event, we have here Mr. Dr. Scott Pace, who couldn't join us physically, but we hopefully next time he will be there. Dr. Scott Pace is director of the Space Policy Institute and a professor of the practice of international affairs at George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. He formerly served as the director of the International Institute of Science and Technology Policy, as well as the Master of Arts program in International Science and Technology Policy. Dr. Pace is also a member of the faculty of the Trachtenberg School of Public Policy and Public Administration. His research includes civil, commercial, and national security space policy and the management of technical innovation. Dr. Pace rejoined the faculty of the Elliott School in January 2021 after serving as deputy assistant to the president and executive secretary of the National Space Council from 2017 to 2020. From 2025 to 28, he served as the associate administrator for program analysis and evaluation at NASA. Professor, thanks for being with us remotely. You were yourself instrumental in creating the framework for the Artemis program. Could you tell us a bit about how you envisioned the Artemis program at the start, and what role, in your opinion, should Europe play in the current phase of moon operation and the current moon race?
Certainly. Okay. And is the audio okay?
Yeah, I think it's perfect.
Okay. So first of all, thank you for the opportunity to be here, and thank you for the flexibility in letting me do this from Vienna, where Chris made it to Paris from Vienna, but I'm still stuck here. And also, it's nice to see many old friends in the audience, Serge Fletchard, Gerard Brachet, Claire Joly. Certainly, you have a great crowd there. So fascinating discussion. Question of procedure, I was going to maybe do some formal remarks, or I can simply go directly into answering your questions. What would you prefer?
You can start with your prepared remarks. That's absolutely fine.
Okay.
If you have time, maybe after a few minutes for audience questions, if there are, be glad.
Absolutely. And so, and being a professor, it's always dangerous to let me go and make remarks. So if I see you starting cutting your throat, I'll know that it's time to wrap up. So I'll try to be relatively brief. I wanted to start by saying that I think Europe today finds itself at a bit of a hinge point in space, much as I think France did in 1950 when it opted for the Schuman Plan for the creation of the European coal and steel community. In both cases, the choice is whether to remain a collection of very capable nation states or to pool sovereignty in some strategically vital domain and thereby shape the rules of the game rather than merely adapt to them. So there's a European moment in space here. The contemporary environment is no longer, of course, a bipolar competition, but a complex system. And I would dare say dominated by the United States and China, with Europe as a third major power by capability, along with Japan, but not really yet by political weight. So Europe has excelled in science, of course, in Earth observation, navigation, application that serve its citizens, but its investments have historically been fragmented and significantly lower than those of the United States and increasingly of China. From a U.S. perspective, the U.S. is strongest, I think, when its leadership is embedded in a coalition of capable and aligned partners. And so Europe's choice over the next decade will determine whether it is this indispensable pillar of that coalition or, again, a fragmented regulatory and industrial space oscillating somewhat between American and Chinese centers of gravity. As others have already said, Europe has a technical capability to be a rule shaper. The question remains is whether it will be able to persuade others on the merits of those rules. Also mentioned, I heard the phrase geopolitical awakening. My colleague at Aerospace Corporation, Mick Gleason, of course, recent report about that, and talked about the European Union agency poised for a substantial expansion of its budget. And of course, we mentioned Germany and its expansion of its budget. Well, money is obviously critical and important. There's more than budget involved. The political will necessary to make those kind of changes is itself significant. So we can debate about how efficiently the money can and should be spent, but the fact that people are willing to talk in those sums is itself, I think, a hopeful sign. So that space is increasingly understood as a core instrument of industrial strategy, digital sovereignty, and collective security, not just a collection of technical programs. Now, with that positive sign, I would have to say that in thinking about commercial space and the competitiveness of Europe, I think former Prime Minister Draghi had a nice report on this subject about European competitiveness. And many of the current European debates, in my view, on AI and space autonomy have to acknowledge a deeper failure. The core recommendations of the Draghi report really haven't been implemented with the urgency and scale I think they require. His message, I thought, was very clear that without a more integrated single market, deeper capital markets, a willingness to mobilize public and private investment, Europe will simply not generate the competitive private sector champions in strategic technologies. Now, his report has been treated as an important reference text, but not really a mandate for action. And when I read some of the SP reports and so forth that have anxiety over European space competitiveness, they sound remarkably similar to me to the anxieties expressed over AI, computing, software, and so forth. Interestingly enough, Japan has some similar issues. Competitiveness of their commercial space industry structurally has many things that look very familiar to its weaknesses in software, cloud services, and other things like that. Now, the consequences in AI are particularly Europe has chosen to lead with regulation. The AI Act layered atop an already dense fabric of data protection and competition rules. I notice all the increasing number of times I have to click, yes, I accept cookies, when I'm here in Europe compared to the US, and lagging at the scale of computing resources and financing, of course, for its own firms. Now, the ecosystem, again, I don't believe was really ever upgraded in line with Draghi's diagnosis. And the same structural weakness, again, as I said, exists in space. So Europe speaks of strategic autonomy, launch, secure connectivity, space services, remain heavily dependent upon external providers because it's not built the industrial and financial environment where European firms can reach the scale of their American or Chinese counterparts. And so the debate over space sovereignty, to my view, too often focuses on institutional reshuffling, excessive politics, I think, as one speaker recommended, ESA versus EU, national agencies versus European programs. Well, sidestepping, I think, Draghi's central report, competitiveness ultimately depends on private sector dynamism, supported by integrated markets and risk-tolerant investment. In that sense, this leads to Europe being between the United States and China, a bit of a triangle that reflects broader geopolitical realignments. And now Europe is not pursuing, hegemony in space the way China has certainly articulated its explicit objective of rivaling or surpassing U.S. leadership in space by mid-century. But Europe is also increasingly unwilling, rightly so, to accept technological or normative dependence on others. So Galileo and EGNOS already provide autonomous alternatives to GPS and Beidou. Next generation secure connectivity program are designed to reduce vulnerability for critical communications and underpin digital sovereignty. Politically, European institutions and member states are disentangling from earlier ambitions, from deeper space cooperation with China, especially on human spaceflight, which, of course, I think is wise. But from a governance standpoint, rules and standards and market access, are becoming as important as hardware, And Europe has the ability to shape export controls, competition policy, data protection, liability rules, on and on. But the challenge is to deploy this regulatory power in support of an open and predictable rules-based order in space, rather than as a substitute for investment or as a tool of defensive protectionism that undercuts transatlantic cooperation. You've certainly seen, the U.S. comments from the Commerce Department and State Department about the EU Space Act. For me, if I look at that act, I see lots of good words that are kind of hard to argue with, certainly in principle. But what worries me is I have no idea of how these will actually be applied in practice. There is a degree of judgment and variation involved that if I was an investor, I would be deeply, deeply skeptical and worried. It's not a particularly predictable environment as to what would happen, except for maybe the outcome of I'm to be excluded from the European market unless I, pay quite a toll. Now, you asked initially about Artemis. Now, this choice about which way Europe goes, I think, is particularly clear in the case of the Artemis program and the Accords. From a strategic standpoint, European participation in Artemis is not merely a matter of industrial return. It's a way for Europe to help shape emerging norms, legal interpretation, operational practices that will govern activities in and around the moon. I've often made the analogy to Antarctica. Norwegians were the first to reach the South Pole. We don't speak Norwegian on the South Pole. We speak a whole range of other languages. And there's an Antarctic treaty system where standards and practices are shaped very largely by the countries that put 3,000 people on the ice every summer. And so everything from fuel types to electrical outlets to kinds of furniture, all kinds of things are shaped by being there. So again, earlier comments made about sustainable presence is really the name of the current competition, not just who's getting there first. So the partnerships in international human spaceflight are as much instruments of foreign policy as they are scientific endeavors. And space cooperation tends to follow geopolitics. It doesn't lead geopolitics. Oftentimes, I'll have students who say, oh, if we can cooperate in space, won't that improve relations on Earth? And I say, no, that's not the way it works. That is, we cooperate with our friends and we cooperate with people that we like, and the cooperation does not have to be equal. It has to be mutually beneficial, but there has to be something. It's not a foreign aid effort. It is something which provides mutual benefit of different kinds, and with people where we have closer relationships in many areas, we can use space to deepen and expand those relationships. So the cancellation of the Gateway program, of course, is very disappointing to Europe. Sadly, as a bit of a space historian, it's not the first time the U.S. has done something bad to Europe. I think of inviting the Russians into the space station without really a lot of notice, the cancellation of the ExoMars program, Halley's Comet, International Solar Polar Mission, and so forth. So one might be a cynic and say, well, what's new? Americans have done this to us before. I think what's new, though, and by the way, I agree with the decision. I have a whole separate critique about Gateway. But I think what's new in the way it's taken is that it's a different geopolitical environment. It's not simply a science project that got delayed. It is really a picture of the larger relationship. And part of the reason why Gateway was even there to be canceled was because it was a kind of a halfway measure. It was done. I was there because Europe wasn't really willing to commit to landing on the moon. It was uncertain about that. But having a station around the moon, kind of like an extension of the space station, was something that I think our European counterparts felt more comfortable with. So it was a halfway measure. It's certainly a good thing to have, but it wasn't a thing that was needed right now. And so that hesitation, in part, led to an architecture decision that I think eventually went badly, but we'll have to try to come back to it. In this sense, Artemis is not a.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut you there, maybe to leave some time for questions from the audience. I think there might be a few of them.
Okay. And let's see. I don't think I really have. I can say a lot more things, but let me just do the closing sentence. Europe's role in space is determined less by what it can do technically, which is already considerable, and more what it chooses to do politically. So leave it at that.
Thank you very much. All right. Do we have questions from the audience then for Mr. Pace? Okay, so we have a question from the panel from Ms. Hotte.
Sorry, thank you so much. You mentioned our European commercial space industry. And if I remember correctly, Sony, and I'd be very interested in your observation on that. So the United States in December or earlier this year issued an executive order on how to maintain superiority in space. And what struck many European analysts was not just a call for greater European contributions to collective defense, but also contributions in terms of the space industrial base in the United States. So the call for Europeans to invest more in the United States in their space industry, while we in Europe, of course, are facing the challenge to build up our own defense or space industry in this regard. So do you see, being based in Washington, any kind of pressure really being put on Europeans in this regard, to have more investment from Europe in the space industry in the United States? Or is it just on paper, let's put it like that?
Yeah.
Or is it already complicating our transatlantic relationship?
Yeah. I haven't seen that as being a particularly heavy or focused thing. Of course, that can change at any moment. But I think the general idea of wanting to have more investment in manufacturing capabilities, in the United States. This is maybe a strange analogy, but one of the experiences of COVID was to make the fragility of global supply chains very visible to everyone. And that the kind of globalization that occurred of what you source from everywhere, and you can, of course, rely on seamless flights and transportation and borders, was shown to have a lot of problems with their vulnerabilities to it. So the idea in general of trying to strengthen up U.S. manufacturing and not be willing to simply outsource that is there. Now, whether or not that applies in a specific case, in a specific deal, is up for discussion. Higher priority items, I think, are certainly things like chip manufacturing. I think the Asia Pacific region is a higher priority. So trying to move semiconductor fabrications so that they're not solely dependent upon Taiwan. I think looking outside of Europe, the Asia Pacific region is much more concerning for the industrial base because if we have a conflict with China, the first goal, of course, is not to have a fait accompli and lose Taiwan, but to stretch the war out, hopefully keeping it non-nuclear. And if it goes into a longer conflict, as in the case of Ukraine, industrial base and capability wind up being critical, and to maintain that. And so I think in looking at weaknesses in the U.S. industrial base, production of munitions, missiles, ships, and so forth, thinking about a broader industrial base in the Indo-Pacific region, sort of like AUKUS 2 on steroids, would be a focus, I think, for us. In the case of Europe, I don't think there's quite that focus on industrial production to meet the Russian challenge. But I think that there's an expectation that Europe would pay more attention to the industrial base in Europe to meet that challenge. So if maybe a piece of free advice, if Europe feels pressured to say you should move a munitions manufacturing capability to the U.S., if you say, well, actually, we're scaling up production here in Europe to counter and offset challenges from the East, so we won't prioritize U.S. for the moment, we will prioritize Europe. That would be a very understandable kind of response. And there have been several examples of that already in the case of Ukraine, artillery shell production, drone production, and so forth. Sorry,
Thank you
bit
very
of a
much.
long answer.
Do we see another question? I see a question at the end here, maybe. Oh. Yes, in front.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Linda. Dr. Scott Pace, thank you for your remarks and for the panel as well. I think it's pretty clear, as someone who's not in this domain myself, I come from a tech background, the vulnerabilities, the capabilities that each country in the EU has, it's pretty clear. Dr. Scott Pace, your remarks that it's not a technical capability, but it's more a policy. What concretely, from a policy perspective, can we do? Because I think you mentioned EU sits at third place alongside Japan after US and China. We've always consistently mentioned fragmentation within the EU, which is, for in best and worst cases, it's a great word, but it is a true word among the EU. What concretely from a policy perspective can we do? Because I think walking away from this conference, I think I came in with the narrative of the science fiction of the moon race, the space race. But when you anchor the narrative closer to the commercialization, the industrial side, that narrative, that storytelling is actually more convincing, I think, from an investor standpoint. And as someone who's not European, I am optimistic about the EU space race. So again, coming back to the question of concretely from a policy perspective, what can EU do?
So if I was to be really maybe cynical or had a few beers, I would say I'm confident about Europeans. I don't know that I'm confident about the EU. So maybe parse that a little differently. I think the recommendations there have been fairly clear. Again, with things like the Draghi report, where the issues of fragmentation, lack of capital access, and so forth have been well known. But I also think there's not just a concrete issue. There's also almost a cultural issue. That is if you looked solely at the numbers for space, and if you were an EU, bureaucrat, you could be forgiven for thinking the space thing there's an overemphasis on it. There are much more important fields, in terms of energy, chemicals, transportation, other areas of the economies across Europe. And the space thing maybe gets too much attention or has disproportionate attention. You can hear the same thing from the Ministry of Trade and Industry in Japan, that's sometimes puzzled by the interest on space. And so it fails to account for not only the soft power aspect of space, but also the degree to which working in space technologies is a massive educational exercise. It is something where you're forced and pushed to learn skills that you would not learn if you just simply stayed at home. So it's a way of increasing your own excellence. It's also a way of expressing confidence in society. I mean, I would argue that a stronger space program in Europe would be a sign of cultural confidence in Europe itself, in its future. If I talk with, say, United Arab Emirates, the Emiratis, and why are they doing things in space? Yes, there's a post-carbon economy thing they want to do, but they're also trying to show a positive future for their own citizens, a non-jihadist path, of one where a woman in a head covering is doing science experiments on a space station or something. It's a positive future. So I think that soft power is not only something to be expressed external to Europe, I think it's also something to be expressed within Europe, and having a confidence about the future. So there are very sort of practical bureaucratic kinds of things in tax law, investment policies, and so forth, financing and support of technology, but there's also a leadership aspect that Europe wants to be part of the future. I'm dealing with Serge Plotard and Gerard Brochet and I and others Europeans know me from days of the EU Galileo negotiations and going back a couple decades. And one of the things that was very striking was that Japan had like about 40% of the world car navigation market very early on in the 90s. They had digital maps and all kinds of things, and they were, took off running. You would have no idea that the car nav device you bought in Akihabara depended on an Air Force satellite signal. The United States in Silicon Valley looked at GPS as an information technology, not as a space technology, and because it got better stock valuations that way. And so they put GPS into construction equipment, survey equipment, fleet management, all kinds of things. Europe lagged in that, not through lack of technology, but because it thought of GPS as an aerospace technology and was waiting for government permission to go into the area and to have its own system before it could really start developing applications. So the capability was always there, but it underperformed for many years. Not now. Galileo now is great, very impressive, but it underperformed for many years because of this conception that this was an aerospace thing that required government permission. The Japanese didn't need any permission. They just went off and did it. Americans didn't need any permission. They went off and did it. So those are kind of a cultural aspect rather than just a hard budget policy choice.
Thank you very much. Maybe a last question, short answer, please.
A short answer, how hopeful?
Yeah, I take the opportunity of having an American high-level policymaker to ask a question, not about Europe, but about the US. So I think Trump, and Biden built the Artemis Accord as a way to share risk, share cost, isolate China and Russia, build a coalition of 50 countries in 5 continents under US leadership, so US symbolic political leadership. Trump is destroying this with a gateway, another decision. Don't you think the US are losing a lot because of the Trump decision of destroying this format of the Artemis Accord? Or if not destroying, damaging, weakening, putting it under question, because there's lots to lose from the US as well.
Sure. So I would say two things. One is actually we didn't really have isolating China as a necessary objective. We've always been clear that if the Chinese wanted to sign the Artemis Accords tomorrow, they'd be welcome to do so. The Artemis program is very different than the Artemis Accords. So I don't see any exclusion per se of China. Now, China may not do it for good political reasons, fine. If they do have a code with the ILRS, and if it all is reasonable with international law, I'll ask Chris for his opinion on the international legal compliance. Then we do cross-recognition and we're done. With regard to the gateway issue, I think in some ways it was, again, while painful, that I think it was important that a decision be made to stop that, because to continue the program simply because it was already there and because of sunk cost, even though it didn't make logical sense in the sequence, and even though it wasn't on the critical path network, would be to build in a bit of dishonesty in the architecture right from the beginning. And so I think it was important more to the integrity of the Artemis program that NASA made the decision, it did. I've been very happy with Jared Isaacson's decisions overall. I recognize the disruptions. I was also unhappy when Charlie Bolden, the previous administrator, broke off negotiations over ExoMars and told Europe to go talk to the Russians for a launch. I mean, I wasn't terribly happy with that. So we spent some time having to think about, okay, what can we do to make it up to Europe on ExoMars? How can we help try to accomplish some of the sample return goals, which are so central to European science priorities? I think the same thing is going to be true here with Gateway as part of the Artemis program. Okay, we did something painful, but we still want Europe to be part of this great endeavor. And what can we do now that is logical rather than simply clinging to something that maybe didn't make sense anymore?
Thank you very much. I'm sorry because I think we could have gone on for hours, but I have to end there, otherwise we're going to be thrown out of Ifri. I just wanted to thank you all very much for coming to Ifri today. We regularly host such conference on contemporary topics, so I encourage you to follow Ifri's website, of course, and social media. With regards to the space program itself, I would point out to the recent publication of an analysis of the Golden Dome initiative that my colleague Alois Fayet and myself have written, which is available on our website, and a few numbers are just outside the door if they are still there. And I would also encourage you to buy and read the latest issue of our review, Politique étrangère, which is have a very special number with a very special anniversary edition. Since Politique étrangère first appeared, was first published in 1936, so we are celebrating 90 years of in-depth analysis of international relations, and the book is available in bookshops, supermarkets, online, or you can even buy here at Ifri. This is the mandatory part. I would also like to thank the team that made everything possible this afternoon, Nathalie, Barbara, Mena, Nicola, Catherine, who allowed these, and of course my colleague Mathilde, who helped me tremendously in organizing this event. The team allows this event to proceed smoothly. I thank you very much. I hope you will have a good evening. I thank the panel and all the people that that participated in this event, and thank you very much, Dr. Pace, for concluding. Thank you very much to all, and I'd be glad to continue this conversation in the future at Ifri during other events. Thank you very much and have a very good evening.